We're so glad that you joined us tonight for Polygamy, What Love Is This? I am your host, Doris Hanson, and we come here each week to talk about polygamy. And we want you to know that living polygamy is neither a God-given right, nor is it an inherent religious right in this country. We're broadcasting live from Salt Lake City, Utah, and this is a telephone call-in program. Our telephone number is 801-973-TV20, 801-973-8820. And if you have questions or comments that you would like to make off the air, you can email us at tv@aboutpolygamy.com. You can watch all of our previous programs on streaming video on our website, whatloveisthis.tv. And if you would like to take a look at the top questions that are asked on our show and our answers, you can go to whatloveisthis.tv/answers. And if the question that you want to ask tonight, or if you want to email to us, is on that website, then you will have the answer there. You won't need to contact us, and you can reformulate another answer or another question. And of course, we have our own questions, and our question for this week is Section 132 of the Doctrine in Covenants blatantly threatens destruction of all those who know about the doctrine but doesn't practice polygamy. And so we would like to know, how can our appointed and our elected public servants ignore an illegal and religious practice that threatens such violence to humans? We'd like you to know that we do have a support group, a discussion group that we meet once a month, and our next meeting is going to be March 15th. That's a Monday evening at 6:30 p.m. It's called the Life After Polygamy Discussion Group. If your life has been touched with polygamy in any way, we would love to have you join us. If you have been in a polygamy group, or if you're still in a polygamy group, you just have questions and you just need someone to talk to, please join us. We'd love to have you. You can telephone tonight and leave your contact information, or you can email us tv@aboutpolygamy.com and we will give you the details. You can also log on to our website, shieldandrefuge.org, and find out more about our organization and also more about polygamy. And if you are in a polygamy group, or you're part of a group and you wish you weren't, or if you're being oppressed or abused in any way, you can find out on that website how we can help you, and we will help you. We'll even help you escape if you would like. We also want those who are in polygamy groups, if you are being oppressed and abused, we want you to know that God is not the author of polygamy. He's not the author of your abuse. And we would like to have the opportunity to prove that to you, and we can prove it. We do have a toll-free number you can call us for help. It's 877-425-9993. That's 1-877-425-9993, and you can call us for help anytime. Next week, our guest will be Sandra Tanner, whom we all know and recognize as being the trailblazer of discovery of the truths of early Mormonism, which of course includes polygamy. And we're going to follow the early Mormon trail of lies and deceits, and their purposeful, systematic lying to hide their polygamist activities and practices. So join us next week. We're sure that you'll love the show. And I have an announcement that I'd like to make that I think that might be of interest to many of our viewers. The Capstone Conference is going to be held on March 12th and 13th. That's a Friday and a Saturday. The conference is free, but pre-registration is highly recommended. And the theme of this conference is the person Joseph Smith, who he was, what he believed, and what he taught. There will be guest speakers from around the nation, and this conference is going to be held at Calvary Chapel, 460 Century Drive in Salt Lake City. And that, again, is March 12th and 13th, and you can access full information of the conference and registration at the website capstoneconference.com. That would be capstoneconference.com. And we'd like to see a lot of you there at the conference. Tonight, our guest excuse me, is a man whom we are sure that you will find very interesting. He is a retired Salt Lake County Sheriff's Lieutenant who specialized in sex crime investigation, which included polygamy complaints. He compiled an intelligence file on Llewellyn. He's the author of several books dealing with the subject of polygamy. He studied Mormon doctrine and at one point himself actually practiced polygamy. He became a Mormon fundamentalist. He was a member of the All-Red Polygamy Group, also known as the AUB, or the Apostolic United Brethren. He is described as a muckraker and a freelance writer, and is recognized as an expert on Mormon fundamentalism. And we welcome our guest tonight, Mr. John R. Llewellyn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Well, you got a lot of information to share with our viewers. I'm sure they'll find it very interesting.
I hope so.
Let's start with the books that you've written. You've written several books, and all of them are dealing with polygamy. Would you like to tell them?
I went to a writing seminar, and they emphasized that you should write something you know about. And I was kind of reluctant to write about polygamy, but it was something I really know something about. Mm-hmm. Not only as a deputy sheriff, but as a writer, but as an investigator in two major lawsuits against two polygamous groups. And one of them, the largest lawsuit, is against Apostolic United Brethren, AUB, which is the same group that I was affiliated with for some years after I retired from the sheriff's office.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that'll make an interesting story. Now, the books that you have written are Polygamy Under Attack from Tom Green to Brian David Mitchell.
Right. My first book was The Murder of a Prophet, and it was a takeoff from the murder of Llewellyn Allred in 1977 by Llewellyn. Uh-huh. And it's kind of a historical fictional characters, but I kind of paralleled that murder because I had done such a big profile on Llewellyn, and of course I was at the scene of the murder at the time.
Mm-hmm. And you did wrote another book that also was kind of a fictional story based on fact, wasn't it? The Teenagers?
Yeah, Teenagers' Tears. And after I wrote my first book about the prophet, I got a lot of contacts from various kids who were trying to leave. Over 50% of the kids that are raised in AUB, for example, will leave. And it's the same with the Harmston group. So they contacted me and they told their stories. And then I'd heard stories from other ladies like yourself that I'd interviewed who had been part of the FLDS or one of the other groups. And so I kind of combined all of those and made one story. And I was kind of flattered. There was some people in the state of Washington that asked if they couldn't make a play out of it.
Oh,
of course, I said, sure, that's fine.
Okay, and then you wrote a book, Polygamy Under Attack, from Tom Green to Brian David Mitchell, the one I mentioned at first.
Right, and it's a factual story, and I go into the lawsuits involving Jim Harmston, and of course, which I investigated. And then the one against AUB, a lady named Virginia Hill, had $1.5 million stolen from her by the leading brethren in AUB.
And we're going to talk about that in more detail next time on the next show, too.
Right. And then, this is kind of interesting. When I found the attorney, Don Redd, who took the case on the contingency, it was through Tom Green. He was introduced to me. And I met him that way, and he became the paralegal while I became the lead investigator in the lawsuit.
Tom Green was?
Yeah, so I got to know Tom Green, and I was flabbergasted when I found out how young his wives were. Mm-hmm. So when they prosecuted him, he talked himself into being prosecuted.
Yes,
he didn't have to go through all that.
He bragged.
And he could have made some deals with David Levitt, the prosecutor at the time, but I wound up being subpoenaed in behalf of Tom Green in his criminal non-support trial. And then David Levitt subpoenaed me in the child rape. And he says, John, will you take the journalist privilege or what? And I says, if you subpoena me, I'll tell the truth. I don't care what happens. I think it helped put him in prison, which is
Good.
where he needed to be.
And then you wrote a book called Polygamy's Rape of Rachel Strong. And I think they're going to have a graphic on the screen with this. And we're going to discuss, if we have time, we're going to discuss Rachel Strong's story tonight. It's a fascinating story, a very sad one, of what can happen. Protected environment for predators.
Yeah,
you underwrite that. Before we discuss Rachel Strong's story, I want to talk a little bit about the legal environment and the laws regarding polygamy in the United States and in Utah, which I think that many of our viewers may be totally unaware of the prohibitions that our laws have on polygamy. So I thought with your experience and with your expertise, we would like you to weigh in on, and I have 3 points that I want to talk about for you to discuss tonight about these legalities. The first one is some people hold that polygamy is a religious doctrine, but they don't know that it has been forever prohibited and is written as such in the Utah Constitution. So would you tell us about the federal and the state laws that are against polygamy?
Well, when Utah was a territory, there were basically 2 laws that the federal government passed regarding polygamy, and of course they had been hearing all of these terrible stories about what was going on. I think the first one was in 1862, the moral law. You may have it written down
The
there.
Anti-Bigamy Act, right.
And it wasn't very effective, and the Mormons were trying to get around it and did get around it to a certain extent. And then the main one was the Reynolds, United States versus Reynolds, and that's the law that's still on the books, and it says that you can go ahead and believe what you want, but if you practice what you believe and it's against the law, you're not protected by the First Amendment.
Right, so people have the right to believe however they want.
Yeah, they can believe
but they don't have the right to behave however they want.
They can make a dog their prophet or a cow or whatever, and of course part of their religion was to marry. You know, it's very interesting when you get to the Section 132. In Judaism, there's over 600 rules. In Mormonism, in Section 132, there's only one rule, and that is you must be a polygamist. And it doesn't tell you how you go about it, it leaves it up to you. So you can use trickery, you can use rape, whatever. And polygamists have used all sorts of gimmicks and tricks to get women to believe, and they become their plural wives.
I think the most effective on that, at least from my memory when I was growing up, was the destruction part. We blackballed from our family, our friends, our group, our God, eternity. The whole bit was just destruction.
Well, you know, the Y chromosome fits in to the male belief. There's just no question about it from all the investigating and having lived it and seen and watched how some of these men act. And it's one thing about the Harmston case and what we're going to talk about here, it shows conclusively that sex is part of the polygamist lifestyle.
Well,
the pursuit of sex.
It definitely does, doesn't it?
They will say, no, it's not about sex, but it is.
It's about having kids, and you have to have sex to have kids. Well, they say it's for having kids.
Yeah, multiplying and replenishing the earth. But what it does is Section 132 conforms with the mission of the Y chromosome, which is to pass it on, and the Y chromosome doesn't care how you do it. You can do it by rape or with children, or and the bad thing, like Tom Green, he married mothers and their daughters,
some polygamists,
and then sisters, and it's still going on. Yeah,
it is. I agree. Well, let's go back to the Utah Constitution now, when they were aiming for statehood, and one of the conditions to become a state was that the formers of the Utah Constitution place in their Constitution a prohibition against polygamy.
Right. That's right.
And they did.
They did. And it says that polygamy shall forever be prohibited.
And it says, it's in Section 3, or Article 3, the ordinance, and it says the following ordinance shall be irrevocable without the consent of the United States and the people of the state of Utah, and that is that polygamy or plural marriages are forever prohibited. So it's not a religious issue, as we seem to be told.
Well, I don't. There's one thing that I noticed, and especially during Warren Jeff's trial, not Ruland Jeff's.
Warren Jeff's?
Warren Jeff's trials. They kept saying that it was not about religion; it was about child molest or rape. And then when religion did come up, the judges, the prosecutors, and the defense attorneys would say, well, they recognized it as a sincere religious belief. And that would be contrary to what you just said about the state constitution, recognizing it as a religious belief. But I don't see it as a religious belief. My investigations and studies shows plural marriage to be about conflict, power, money, and sex. And I don't care how you investigate or look at it, from what direction, that's what you're going to come up with.
And we can put this on the leadership level, because most of the members are not involved with that. They're just following their leader, doing what they're told they're supposed to do.
Most of the complaints that I have received, and everything, and most of what I write about in my books, are about the leaders. It's the leaders where the problem is.
And they know what, yeah. Okay. In your book, in the Polygamy, the Rape of Rachel Strong, you noted that laws have been passed to protect those in polygamy groups against the abuses. And you talk about in 2001, a passage of Bill 146 made it a crime for anyone to perform an illegal marriage.
Right.
And in that also makes a child bigamous marriage a felony.
Right.
An adult marriage is a
depending on the
misdemeanor.
age of the girl, if she's young enough, it becomes a felony. Yeah. Right. I was up at the legislature. I went up with Tapestry Against Polygamy, and during one of the hearings, I was able to give my 2 cents to it. But nobody's seems to be interested. There's never been any arrests, and I brought it up in Rachel Strong's case that there was not only bigamy. I felt that there had been rape. All the elements of a rape were present, and there was an illegal marriage. But neither the Utah Attorney General or the Sanpete County Attorney was interested in it.
And you know what, John? I know for a fact that many marriages, planned marriages, they've tipped the Attorney General's office off in advance of where these were going to take place, who was going to perform, and who were the bride and groom, the age of the girl. Some of them are relatives, cousins, and
incest.
And they will not act on those tips. They absolutely haven't acted on any of them.
It's interesting. During the Virginia Hill investigation, my partner and I met with one of the criminal investigators with the IRS, and we tried to get him to initiate a criminal complaint against some of the suspects to the federal government. And he said since Ruby Ridge and Waco in Texas, that it's just really tough to get a prosecutor interested in prosecuting a religious group, especially fanatics, because of the bad press that they got. So what we're not only talking about religion, we're talking about political correctness and politics.
Yeah, we are.
It's all intertwined and involved.
But the abuses that are going on, it just goes on.
Well, I think a lot of them have slowed down since the 2 lawsuits and then the conviction of Tom Green and Warren Jeffs.
And the FLDS.
But it's going to happen again, because I know the mentality. You know the mentality of these people, and there's so many fanatics involved that they're going to do what they want. I mean, they'll
try and hide it, just like they did.
I could sit here for 2 or 3 hours and tell you about the different people that have called me, the complaints they've made, and how we've tried to get law enforcement to take some actions in some terrible incest cases where men are having sex with their adolescent daughters, their blood daughters. And this goes on, and they justify it, through their religious belief.
Yes,
it's wrong.
I agree. It is wrong. It's awful. It's let's go to the second point that I wanted to ask you about, and that is the decriminalization. There's those who actively pressure and lobby for decriminalization of polygamy so that each group can handle their own problems and the government won't have to get involved with it. They can more or less govern themselves. You talked about it quite a bit in this book, and what I would like for you to tell our viewers is, pardon me, do you think polygamy should be decriminalized? What are the pros and cons of it being decriminalized, and the likely result if it were?
Well, no, there's valid arguments on both sides, and I've been on both sides. So I can see the polygamist point of view as well as society's point of view. And I've talked to so many victims of polygamy, ladies and young ladies, that I'm convinced the wrong thing to do is to decriminalize it. Well, to begin with, they'd have to get an amendment to the Constitution and maybe an act of Congress if they can't do it without the federal government's permission.
It says it has to. The federal government has to.
So what they're trying to do, and this is what Mr. Shurtleff has been suggesting, is that they reduce it down to a misdemeanor. But his policy has been that unless an underage girl is involved, they don't want to be bothered with it. It doesn't matter how much coercion or force is involved. If she's 18 or over, they don't want to be bothered with it. And Mr. Shurtleff and I have had some real disagreements over that.
So what would be, some people say if it's decriminalized, it seems like it would be more open and more visible what's going on, and others think that dig their heels in deeper and be even more secretive.
That's a myth. They say if it was decriminalized, that the victims would be more apt to come and report and have confidence in the law. But that's a fallacy, because each one of these prophets claimed to be the only one who has the authority to seal the plural marriages where you will go to the celestial kingdom.
Right.
That's the whole key to it right there. It doesn't matter how liberal it was. Owen Allred, for example, when people were starting to talk about that, he wrote a letter to the Attorney General. It wasn't Shurtleff at that time. It was his predecessor. And he says, if you would let me be in charge of all the plural marriages, I'd make sure it was all according to Hoyle, that everything would be run right. Well, gosh, that's like letting the wolf or the coyote into the
fox guard the hen house or something like that.
But he was afraid that if it was liberalized, that everybody would want these plural marriages. But that's really not the case. It's not an easy lifestyle. It's because of who has the authority. Is it Jim Harmson? Is it Warren Jeffs? Is it Lemoyne Jensen? Or is it the president of the LDS Church? If you can convince somebody that you have the authority and only you can get you to the celestial kingdom, then what they do is they merchandise it, because you're not going to get a plural wife unless you make a good donation, or unless you're a full tithe payer.
Give me all 10%. Of your property. That's right. And so on and so forth.
It's a business.
Yeah.
And it's a very lucrative business. In AUB, they submitted in a trial documents showing that they received about $1 million in tithing alone a year. Now that doesn't count the other donations that are made.
And all their businesses.
Or the real estate. Yeah. Well, you know, the Kingston Group are good at businesses, and even the FLDS, they have some profitable businesses. But I have a list of several businesses that AUB has gotten involved with, and they've all failed, and they've just lost money. Huh. There's this assumption that if you have this high priesthood calling, that you're not only knowledgeable about God and Mormonism, but you're knowledgeable about business too, and then they're not. They're terrible businessmen. The best business that they're into is merchandising plural wives.
And they are, and
they're very good at that.
And making children. I'd like to mention that if you have any questions for John Llewellyn, please call. Our number is 801-973-TV20, 801-973-8820, and we will be taking questions in just a few minutes. So let's go to number 3. There are those that hold that polygamy is a trap, where predators are drawn. They're easily drawn to it, and where the human trafficking and the abuse of women and children go unchecked, and that it should be totally abolished. And of course, this takes us to the story of Rachel Strong that you wrote about her case. I'd like you to tell the story of Rachel Strong, but before you get into the story, if you don't mind, I'd like to read from the preface of your book what you wrote about Rachel Strong being raped. You said, Rachel Strong was raped. She was raped by her polygamous prophet, stepfather, 45 years her senior, who claims he was living his religion. She was raped by a published doctrine that warns, submit, or be destroyed by God. She was raped by a Utah movement to decriminalize polygamy, which we just discussed, and she was also raped by the new political correctness. Tell us about Rachel Strong, what group she's in, her age, and what happened.
Okay, her mother was a divorcee and had several children, and she became Jim Harmston's third wife when Rachel was age 12. So they're a lot like the FLDS, and they keep their people isolated, even though they live in the small town of Manti. So she was, all of her associates were part of the group, and then they had their own private school. So she was indoctrinated to believe that this man was the prophet, and he had control over their exaltation. When she was it's quite a long, convoluted story, and if try to capsulize it, she was married to a young man, and she had a child. The child was 3 years old. But Jim had an eye for her, and he caused them to be divorced. And then he tried to convince her that she was evil, and that the only way that she could be saved was for him to step forward and marry her, that she had to become his wife.
And this was all part of his brainwashing technique to get her under his control.
And he had 2 of his other wives helping to indoctrinate her and putting ideas into her head and having her pray with them. And of course the prayer was, you've got to trust the prophet, and you do what the prophet says. He's the Lord's anointed. And in other words, these prophets are surrogate gods. You're really worshiping the prophet, not God or Jesus Christ, because he is the embodiment of Christ, because he knows Christ, and only he knows what Christ wills and what should be man. So the way to get along in one of these groups is to butter up to the prophet, and these guys do. And if you have money, or if you have a lot of daughters, you know, a polygamous family, if a man has a lot of young daughters, it's like money in the bank.
It's a commodity, isn't it?
Right, because you can dicker with the other people and work your way into high priesthood officials, and they will often try to have one of the high officials marry their daughters, because that gives them a connection. It's like old in England and France, you know, exchanging wives or daughters to marry.
In this story about Rachel Strong, you mentioned, this was very disturbing to me, and I'm sure it is to many people, that Harmston had put in charge of the women, and for some intents and purposes the men as well, 3 women who had been on probation. They had been charged with as accessories to crimes against children.
Right.
And here these women are, sex crimes against kids, and they're in charge of these people in the group. Tell us, what degree did Harmston use them to bring Rachel Strong as a plural wife?
Well, just as I said, that he would put them over him, put these women over her. She couldn't make a move without them being there to advise her. And a lot of it had to do with the different prayers. They would kneel with prayer, and in they would
say things
control
in the prayer.
right, to make her conform with whatever the prophet wanted, which of course was. Now, these women were a part of the Freeze group, and I don't know if you remember that. That's going way back.
Yes.
And he might still be in prison, but there was a lot of pedophilia, you know, and there's pedophilia in every single one of the groups. And
yes, there is.
There was something about the All Red group was pretty free of pedophiles. Well, that's not true at all. 3 of their high priest councilmen, which is the same as an apostle in the church, they had to get rid of because of they were suspected pedophiles. And one of them, I think, is still down in prison. One of them, I've investigated almost every type of a sex crime you could imagine while as a deputy sheriff. But what this man did with his own wives and grandsons and daughters is just, it's terrible. I mean, and they do it using their religious authority to coerce and overcome the resistance of these young girls
and they
people
can't.
and
They
their
have
wives.
nothing to fight back. They have no one to protect them and no way to fight back.
There was one case, and I think you probably know who they were, but when they're adults now, but when they were children, their father was molesting them, and they'd always been taught, if you're in danger of something, pray to God, and He will help you and rescue. And they could hear the father footsteps coming down the hall, and they knew that he was coming into their bed, and they would pray and they would pray, and nothing happened except they were molested. And it's interesting that I've noticed a lot of people that come out of the polygamous group who have been molested become skeptics like myself or atheists.
Someone made the remark not too long ago that too many young people are growing up in the polygamy group atheist. And
well, they contribute to atheism, in my opinion.
They do. I mean, when they say God is the one who requires this kind of a life, who wants that kind of a God?
Right.
It's awful. Right. Well, it looks like we've got some calls coming in, John.
Good.
We've got an off-the-air question, Michael from Ogden, for you. He says, what are some of the ways the law would investigate and prosecute these polygamists?
Well, in the beginning, it was really tough to build a case because you have to have witnesses. You have to have witnesses of the actual marriage ceremony, and then you have to put them together, living together. I know I spent a lot of nights trying to build a case against a polygamist. His wife died, and he had the children, and the grandparents wanted the children back. He wasn't the father, he was just the adopted father. And it's just a tough way unless you have somebody that actually eyewitnesses or somebody involved in marriage that will testify. In Rachel Strong's case, we had everything. It's probably, I think it's the best bigamy case that has ever been prepared in the state of Utah. And it was handed to the Attorney General and the San Pete County Attorney on a silver platter, and they turned their nose up at it.
Did nothing.
And the Attorney General didn't even have the courtesy to let her know that he had declined prosecution. One of the investigators tipped me off. And there's some good investigators up at the Attorney General's office. I've met a few. I worked with them when they were in other law enforcement. And he's got some good investigators that are able to do the job. It's when it gets to the attorneys to make the decide whether there's going to be a complaint or not.
Yeah. Very good. It is hard when there's no victim, isn't it? I knew of a case where I actually called, and they said you have to bring a victim.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do unless a victim comes forward.
You know, there's strict rules on how you go about building a case, and you have to have the different elements of the crime. In a rape case, you have to have penetration, resistance, and I got a mental block. And force.
And force, okay.
Naturally.
All right. We have Alan calling from Ogden. Let's take his call. Hello, Alan.
Hi.
Hi, you're on the air. Hi.
Keep up the good work, and I do have a comment and a couple questions.
Okay.
For you. It seems as though these polygamous groups are just going by the works of the law and not from the freedom of the gospel. How do these polygamous groups justify themselves? I don't understand. Where is the freedom from these many bondages?
Well, they don't understand freedom in the sense that a Christian does, in the sense that Jesus has provided our freedom from the law. They don't understand that because they're raised under the law. They believe that it's a law. They take it from section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which threatens damnation and destruction if you don't follow their law of polygamy. So they don't even understand. You know, that was one of the most beautiful things I found when I finally became a Christian, was that freedom that is promised. But they don't get it. They don't understand it.
But for the law's sake, don't you, if you're going to live by the law, don't you have to follow all the law?
Well,
or there's no salvation?
Right.
Could I say something?
Sure, please. Please do.
What they say is, if there's a conflict between God's law and the law of man, they're going to obey God's law.
And God's law is polygamy.
Right, and that's the way they justify it.
Oh, okay. Okay, I understand. Well, it seems to me not God's way.
But
it isn't. Sure. It isn't, Alan. It's not God's way, really.
And it is a sad thing. I really feel bad for these people.
Well, you know, there is some good people that are polygamists, but they're very religious and they really believe in it. And there's many of them who would not do what Warren Jeffs has done or what Owen Allred or Lemoyne Jensen's done, steal other people's money. But they believe that these men have the keys and hold the keys to their salvation. So it kind of makes them, in a sense,
in a way,
perpetrators after the fact, you know.
Yeah. It kind of almost elevates them to being like a God-man, pretty much.
Well, that's what I mentioned. These prophets are actually surrogate gods.
Yeah.
And they think they're gods in embryo, really. They're learning how to become a god and will be God after they die.
And the more wives they have, the more worlds they will have, like this world here. And they will be the god over that world for every wife they have.
Isn't that how Satan fell?
Well, yes. He wanted to become like God, and God says, I don't think so, and booted him out.
Yeah. I don't think Satan worries about a marriage relationship. He's just plain promiscuous.
No.
Well, Alan, did we answer your questions?
You answered it perfectly, and God bless you too.
Thank you.
I think you're doing a great job.
Thank you, Alan. We appreciate your call.
Thank you.
Good night. Okay, Terry from Hooper is calling. Hello, Terry. Yes, you're on the air.
Hello.
Hello, you're on the air.
Okay.
Is your TV turned down?
I am turned down.
Okay, what's your question?
My question is, I'd like to clarify because I'm not real sure. Was polygamy with the LDS church when they were traveling before they settled in Utah an acceptable practice? But there was a change later that I understand that then polygamy was not permitted anymore, and then there was, the LDS church followed that, and then there was the few that went on to practice the LDS, the polygamy portion of that. Can you tell me what the change was? What caused a shift from polygamy being permitted to not being permitted? What was that change?
Actually, polygamy never was legal. Anywhere the Mormons went, it was never legal anywhere. But the change you're talking about was the manifesto that Wilford Woodruff declared that they would cease living polygamy in 1890, and they had to do that in order for the state, Utah, to become a state. That was one of the things that they had to give up in order to become a state. Do you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, that's correct. But there were a lot of people who went down into Mexico because there was no laws against polygamy in Mexico. And there were 2 apostles who continued to live it secretly. And it was discovered in 1905, and President George Albert Smith, I think it was, had to issue a second manifesto after that.
Because they continued to live it.
Right. And then it was in the 20s, I guess, that... what was his name? Lauren Woolley came along, and then Joseph Musser, and then what we know as fundamentalism began then.
Well, when polygamy was outlawed with the manifesto, the first manifesto and the second one, there were so many of the Mormons who were practicing polygamy that believed truly that Joseph Smith saw God and that God demanded polygamy for salvation, and they meant to live it. They weren't going to give it up.
You know, there's an interesting story that has been repeated 2 or 3 times. And Joseph Smith told some of the very few that he indoctrinated and brought into it that an angel came to him and with a sword and threatened to lop off his head if he didn't live the principle. Well, Jim Harmston had that same angel come to him, and so did Llewellyn Allred.
Did he? And funny thing too, he'd already been living polygamy for several years when he claimed that angel came and told him he better get with
Secretly,
it. Secretly,
yeah.
Did that answer your questions?
Yeah, more so. I guess so. Joseph Smith did practice polygamy.
Oh, yes.
And then I'm not sure exactly what the manifesto did to then cease the practice of polygamy.
Well, it didn't. It didn't cause polygamy to stop. It just caused them to go into hiding. Like John said, some of them went to Mexico, some of them went to Canada, some of them got thrown in jail because they refused not to live it, or not to give it up, I should say. And eventually, though, they had to give it up because the pressure was getting too great. And that's when the fundamentalists broke off from the mainline church and started their own little groups.
I think if you was to take 132 and just have it disappear, that would solve the polygamy problem. Because it's such, how many first wives want to share their husband with other women and their assets, without something to cause her to do it? Well, Section 132 does that. And you can read verses 55, 64 and 65, in which it says that you'll either accept it or you'll be destroyed.
Right. Absolutely right. And
that's
what
the
they
inducement.
do. That's the key. Okay, Terry, that help you?
Yeah, I'm still not completely getting it, but we have to start. But thank you very much for your time.
Okay, and Terry, if you want to email tv@aboutpolygamy.com, we can answer your questions in more detail through email if you'd like.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you for calling. Okay, I thought we had another call there, but it looks like it's off the screen. We have an off-the-air question here. Susan from New York called. She wants to know about the Levirate marriage, where a widow would marry a brother-in-law in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. The Christian polygamists say that this is a mandate for polygamous marriage. It absolutely, totally is not. First of all, there's no such thing as a Christian polygamist. That's contradictory in terms. A Christian will obey every law that God has laid down because the law is written on our heart. Even though we're saved by grace, the law is still written on our heart. So a Christian will not be a polygamist. However, that Levirate marriage is... people that read that are assuming that brother-in-law that she's marrying is already married, and there's nothing in the text that says he's married. God had already laid out that monogamy was his plan and was his perfect plan for marriage, and so we can assume from that anything that he says after that is not going to command or mandate something opposite, something contradictory. There is nothing in Deuteronomy chapter 25, 5 through 10 that tells us that brother-in-law is already married. Now you're going to come back and say, well, there's nothing that says he isn't married. That doesn't prove that he is married. It doesn't prove that God wanted polygamy at all. It only proves that woman has the right to go to a brother-in-law and ask him, and just like Ruth did with Boaz, if you want to read the Luke chapter, well, it's only 4 chapters in Ruth, but that will give you an idea. Boaz was not married, and the brother-in-law doesn't need to be married either. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, line 2, we have Mike from Salt Lake. Hello, Mike. Hello, Mike.
Yes, hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
Hi, Doris.
Hi.
It's Llewellyn. Good evening. I have a legal question. Let's see. Earlier, Mr. Llewellyn stated that polygamy is illegal under both state and federal law. That's correct.
You say illegal?
Is illegal under state and federal.
what are your thoughts as to why the Attorney General's short list does not prosecute these men for these criminal acts of polygamy? I just don't understand that. Why isn't that his job? Do you have any thoughts as to why the Attorney General doesn't prosecute people for polygamy, not for? Seems like they only get involved when there's child molestation involved and can be proven, but they won't prosecute for polygamy.
Okay.
That's my question.
One of the excuses that law enforcement has for not enforcing it, first of all, it would be uneconomical to go after every polygamist just for polygamy's sake alone. So you have to narrow it down. I found that out when I was with the sheriff's office. In fact, when Paul Van Dam was the Attorney General, he took us up to Judge Anderson, who had a civil case going in which there was polygamy involved. And he says, we've got a serious social problem out here. What are you doing about it? And the judge asked me, and I says, well, we've got a lot of rapes and murders and burglaries and things of this nature, and this, in a sense, without a victim, is a victimless crime. So at one time they couldn't decide whether it ought to be under vice or under the sex crimes. But so what the Attorney General has done is saying, if I go after one, I have to go after them all. This is what he had told me. So they had to narrow it down to they'll only go after the ones involving a girl under age 18. So that's where he'd draw the line. And the Sanpete County Attorney, Mr. Blackham, I think he's more of a turkey farmer than he is an attorney. I'm told that's where he spends most of his time. And he says, without any explanation, I took Rachel in there, we sat there and gave him the presentation, all the facts, the coercion, the proof, and he says, well, my policy is the same as the Attorney General's policy, and just brushed us off. But it's my contention, as you'll see if you read the book about Rachel Strong, that any time the coercion and force is used, no matter how old the girl is, Rachel was 20 at the time, the same force that was used with the Wall girl that convicted
Warren
Jeffs occurred with her. The only difference between the two is one was 20 and the other was 15 or 16. But it should, in my opinion, it should be the force and the coercion and the resistance which makes the determination, not the age of the victim. I mean, the trauma was every much, if not more severe with Rachel. I mean, Tapestry Against Polygamy myself put up money to have her go to a psychologist, which really helped bring her around. And in his point of view, the same force, the religious coercion was equal to a gun being pointed at her head. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's more traumatic because it stays. I talked with a lady that was a victim 15 years ago. Just the other day she called me. She's still traumatized. She still lives it. She still has nightmares. I've investigated dozens and dozens of rape cases, and the same elements are there, except they just happen over a period of time rather than at one time, instantaneously. Mm-hmm. That's what really convinced me that decriminalization should not happen. If they don't like to use the crime of bigamy, but bigamy has been upheld by the Utah Supreme Court twice. If that's the way to get a bad guy off the streets, that's what they should use.
Right.
We did that in law enforcement. You had a burglar, and the only thing you could get him on was a misdemeanor. The prosecutors went along with it because he was a bad guy. We'd get him with whatever we could. And that's what should happen with these predators in the polygamous subculture.
Does that answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, it informs me a little bit more about the Attorney General's office.
And as citizens, we can always write our letters and make our phone calls too. And
I've sent many to their office.
Oh, well, just good.
See,
not many. Just
a prosecutor has discretionary powers. And that's what Mr. Shurtleff is using, is discretionary powers.
Look the other way when it's just so blatantly out there, and it's even in the Salt Lake Tribune, regarding stories that
Yeah.
that helps me understand the Attorney General's office a little bit better as to their non-action
Yeah.
against
Okay.
polygamists. So,
Well, thank you, Mike. We appreciate your call.
okay, thank you.
Good night. Okay, we have an off-the-air question, and that fits right in with some of the information I wanted to talk to you. The off-the-air question is from Sanpete, a Manti area. The questioner wants to know about the men in the Harmston group who are guards at the Gunnison prison. They have taken an oath that they will uphold the law, either both the U.S. Constitution and the Utah Constitution. And that fits right in with what I wanted to ask you about the Attorney General. And when he took office, as well as any other elected official, when they take office, they take an oath to uphold the Constitution. Whether if you're a polygamist attorney or a polygamist guard at the Gunnison prison, they take this oath. Is their mandate to protect the people and the abuses, or is their mandate to protect the abusers? And when the guards were being groomed down at the prison, there were quite a few people that complained, that were against this. And the powers that be told them to shut up, be quiet, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's going to be. And now they're guarding.
Well,
they're felonies themselves, felons themselves.
Yeah, I'll give Mark Shurtleff credit. There were police officers that had gone to post, Peace Officer Standard Training, in the town of Hillsdale, part of the FLDS. And he went to work and got them decertified so that they could no longer be policemen, because there is definitely a conflict of interest.
Yes.
And there was plenty of evidence to show that these police officers were Warren Jeffs police officers, not the state of Utah or the town.
Absolutely.
And I don't know, this is the first that I knew that there were practicing polygamists who were employed as guards at the Gunnison prison.
Yeah, what would happen if a polygamist got sent in prison now? So we got polygamists guarding polygamists.
See, that one Kingston fellow was down
David
there for
was
2
down
or
there
3 years,
for
and
5 years, I think.
Warren Jeffs was there for a little while, was he? And
I don't know if he's in Gunnison. I don't remember.
maybe it wasn't
I think he
Gunnison.
was in Purgatory and
Yeah,
Hurricane.
that's right, Purgatory, yeah.
But at any rate,
So-
there
could be a
only in
conflict
Utah,
of interest.
right? Only in Utah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the conflict is this. They take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And the Utah Constitution says polygamy will be forever prohibited.
Well, you're supposed to be a felon if you're a practicing polygamist, and so they have suspected felons guarding other prisoners.
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I suppose that they could. There wouldn't be a conflict, but it seems to me that there's no gray area here. This looks like a gray area. It's either go if or in or out or.
Now, you made the comment during one of our conversations that in charging someone with a crime, and we're talking about the crimes that are going on in these groups and how they're not being prosecuted, but you made the comment that in charging someone with a crime, that the authorities can use whatever law is possible to put this person out of his business, whatever he's doing. Would you explain what that means and why they don't use this with the polygamy group leaders?
Because they have a policy and they're sticking to that policy and they're not budging. I think political correctness has a lot to do with it. And if you look at it this way, probably half of the native Utahns can trace their ancestry to some polygamists.
At least
I
half.
can, yeah, a lot of them.
Yeah.
And there's this myth that polygamy was practiced on a higher level during Brigham Young's time than it's practiced now. That's a myth. I've done the research,
Totally
I've got the books, the documentary. The same disgusting things that are going on now happened then, where they were marrying mothers and daughters, the incest, the young girls, everything was going on then that's going on now. I think that maybe it's subliminal, but there's some sympathy for the polygamists. I've seen it at even some of our United States senators have said that they are good people. You know?
I agree with that.
And so I think political correctness to politics has a lot to do with it. In Texas, it'd be a different thing.
It is a different thing down there. Okay, we're getting close to the end of the show. Really quick on the off-the-air question, Kevin from Bountiful, if polygamy is mandatory for celestial heaven, are today's Mormons just living for the first and second level? According to true Mormon doctrine, yes, but according to what the LDS believe, no. They wouldn't believe that because they don't believe that they have to live polygamy now. However, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and all the others said that they did. John will be on our show again next month on March 11th. We're going to talk more about the AUB polygamy group and some of his other experiences. If you have questions tonight or think of any during the next 2 or 3 weeks, you may give us a email. And of course, he does have a blog that you might want to get involved with. It's polygamybooks.org, right?
Right, correct.
Polygamybooks.org for his blog. And for those, phone call Jean from Ogden, would you email me, or you can call next week, whatever your question is. We're sorry we can't get to it. I want to make some closing comments on the show. We discuss different philosophies and biblical commands and legal requirements and other aspects of our culture. But at the end of the day, if we walk away from our discussions and nothing's changed, what is it all worth? All humans are created with a conscience, with an inner nudge of what's right and wrong, and generally we all recognize that abuse is wrong. Hurting someone for personal benefit or to satisfy unrestrained anger or unrestrained sexual desire is wrong. In fact, it's so blatantly wrong that most of the nations of the world have set up laws against it. Yet contrary to the law of the land, our illustrious Utah political machine determines to ignore the lifestyle of polygamy, the very breeding ground of so many of these abuses. This is an injustice and it's destructive to society and to human beings. Just as Rachel Strong has not been protected, or justice ever even having been attempted on her behalf, this is only the tip of the iceberg. When will people of conscience rise up and say, this is enough? Psalm chapter 82 verse 3 tells us that we are to defend the poor and the fatherless, to do justice to the afflicted and the needy. And that's what we need to do. And this certainly includes the abuses of those who are helplessly trapped in polygamy. May you do your part too. Thanks for watching our show, and we'll see you again next week. Good night.